Iran has submitted a ceasefire proposal through Pakistan, while simultaneously positioning Ghadir-class mini-submarines at the narrowest chokepoints of the Strait of Hormuz. Let that sink in for a moment. This is not a contradiction. This is the standard operating procedure of a regime that has reached the inflection point of its 4-7-year strategy and now finds itself trapped by the logic it created. Tehran understands the math is turning decisively against it. Yet instead of adjusting course, it continues committing its scarcest naval assets in ways that further narrow its own options. For nearly 5 decades, the Islamic Republic has used the strait as both shield and sword. That doctrine has now become self-destructive. The regime's survival calculus rests on raising the global cost of confrontation faster than Washington is prepared to accept. This is no longer a sustainable strategy. This is calculated self-destruction. Every diplomatic gesture is now paired with irreversible military commitments that make retreat increasingly costly. This is the grim reality of where this conflict stands. Tehran's leadership no longer has a viable off-ramp. The point of no return is approaching. While Tehran submits ceasefire proposals through Pakistani channels, the IRGC has already initiated its most serious deployment beneath the Strait of Hormuz. This is textbook diplomatic deception. The regime uses negotiations to buy time while committing its remaining naval assets to irreversible positions. The key platform is the Ghadir-class mini-submarine, 29 meters in length, 125 tons displacement, and a crew of only 7. A direct derivative of North Korea's Yono class, these vessels were never designed for conventional fleet operations. They exist solely for shallow water ambush and attrition. Read that again. Iran's most capable naval units are now small diesel-electric platforms optimized to rest on the seabed for extended periods in waters averaging just 36 meters deep. Complex thermal layers, strong bottom currents, and salinity gradients in the strait significantly degrade even advanced sonar effectiveness. Their propulsion signature merges easily with commercial shipping traffic, allowing them to remain undetected for days in passive mode. Here's where the calculus becomes self-destructive. Each Ghadir is armed with Voyager heavy torpedoes and JASC, 2 submarine-launched cruise missiles weapons theoretically capable of threatening high-value surface targets. By concentrating these limited assets at the narrowest chokepoints, Tehran has staked a decisive portion of its naval capital on a high-risk gamble. That tactical disruption can generate political leverage it can no longer achieve through conventional means. This is no longer a sustainable strategy. This is calculated self-destruction. The regime is now forced to use its scarcest and most difficult-to-replace resources to compensate for decades of strategic overreach. Every additional submarine deployed further narrows Tehran's own options and raises the internal cost of any future retreat. The commitment is deepening, with each vessel moved into position. The diplomatic overture continues above the surface, but beneath it, the regime has already crossed a threshold that leaves very little room for reversal. Washington has refused to play the familiar Iranian game. In direct response to the submarine deployment and diplomatic maneuvering, the United States has implemented one of the most extensive naval blockades in recent decades. The operation is built around the USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group, reinforced by more than 20 major surface combatants. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, San Antonio-class amphibious ships, Independence-class littoral vessels, and Virginia-class nuclear submarines now maintain tight control across the strait. Above them, P-8 Poseidon aircraft deploy sonobuoys while EA-18G Growlers suppress Iranian coastal radars and communications. The intent is clear. Movement through the strait will follow American conditions only. The United States is not pursuing open confrontation. It is applying calculated paralysis. A-18 Super Hornets have already conducted precision strikes on several empty Iranian flag tankers, including MTC Star 3, MT Sevda, and MT Hosna, targeting engine rooms and rudder systems. The ships were not sunk. They were deliberately disabled and left adrift, denied access to Iranian ports. 61 commercial vessels have been forced to reroute. This is methodical economic pressure, executed with deliberate restraint to avoid ecological fallout or uncontrolled escalation. Iran is losing approximately $500 million in oil revenue every single day. This rate of hemorrhage is compounding damage to an economy already stretched to breaking point. What makes this genuinely different is the disciplined calibration, sufficient force to dismantle Iran's strategy, yet carefully measured to control the threshold of escalation. This is no longer a sustainable strategy for Tehran. The Revolutionary Guard submarines, once intended as decisive ambush assets, are now confined beneath a dense American sensor network of towed arrays, dipping sonars, and AI-supported acoustic analysis. Their operational window is narrowing by the day. The United States has converted the Strait's geography, long considered Iran's advantage, into a controlled environment that exposes the fundamental limits of asymmetric warfare when faced with superior persistence and technological depth. Iran's naval doctrine rests on one central premise. It cannot defeat the United States in conventional terms, so it must make continued American presence too expensive to sustain. Let that sink in for a moment. This approach has produced a vicious cycle. The Ghadir submarines, fast attack craft, kamikaze drones, and naval mines are all instruments of the same attrition strategy. On paper, they form a multi-layered threat. In practice, they expose the merciless mathematics of mismatch. Each Ghadir requires a 7-man crew operating in extended silent mode. Every speedboat or drone expended consumes irreplaceable trained personnel and precision munitions that sanctions make extremely difficult to replace at scale. The regime is attempting to impose exponential costs using linear and steadily declining resources. The numbers don't lie. Iran is burning finite capital to generate temporary friction that Washington has repeatedly shown it can absorb. Here's where the calculus becomes self-destructive. The daily loss of approximately $500 million in oil revenue already equals a significant portion of the IRGC's operational budget. This hemorrhage accelerates the manpower deficit, especially among the limited pool of experienced submariners and missile technicians. These specialists cannot be rapidly replaced, and every week of extended deployment or attrition deepens the strain. The United States has responded with layered, persistent capabilities. Advanced sonar networks, electromagnetic dominance, and AI-supported acoustic analysis continue to shrink the operational space available to Iranian assets. What the IRGC designed for an opponent who would eventually hesitate no longer encounters that hesitation. This is no longer a sustainable strategy. This is calculated self-destruction. Tehran is trading its scarcest resources, trained crews, limited munitions, and its most advanced stealth platforms for marginal disruption that does not alter the fundamental balance of power. Every day the blockade holds, the asymmetry grows wider rather than narrower. The doctrine that once compensated for conventional weakness has now become the primary driver of Iran's strategic erosion. Stay with us. The inflection point is no longer approaching. It is here. Iran has now reached a genuine inflection point, one it has not faced in its 7-year history. For the first time since the founding of the Islamic Republic, the regime is forced to commit its most valuable and irreplaceable naval assets, the entire operational fleet of Ghadir mini-submarines, into positions from which retreat is almost impossible. These vessels represent Tehran's highest-end asymmetric capability. Once placed on the seabed at the narrowest chokepoints, they cannot be easily withdrawn without signaling strategic collapse. Here's where the calculus turns self-destructive. The IRGC is confronting a severe manpower deficit, particularly among the small cadre of experienced submariners capable of operating these platforms for days in silent, high-risk conditions. These crews cannot be mass-produced. Losses or extended deployments are already straining a force that was never large to begin with. At the same time, the daily $500 million revenue collapse is accelerating internal fractures. Hardliners within the Revolutionary Guard demand immediate escalation, viewing any restraint as betrayal of the revolution. Pragmatic factions understand that further provocation risks a preemptive American strike capable of destroying years of carefully concealed infrastructure in a single campaign. Tehran is now burning through its scarcest resources, trained specialist personnel, limited precision munitions, and its most advanced stealth platforms simply to maintain the illusion of leverage. The regime's leadership has trapped itself. Concession would shatter its ideological legitimacy with its core base. Escalation invites overwhelming retaliation that could erase its remaining naval and missile capacity. Both paths lead to the same destination: irreversible erosion of the Islamic Republic's long-term power. This is the grim reality of where this conflict stands. For the first time in decades, Tehran no longer controls the tempo of events. It has become prisoner to the very trap it set beneath the strait. The point of no return is no longer theoretical. It is measurable in weeks. The economic hemorrhage has become irreversible. With roughly $500 million in daily oil export revenue cut off by the American blockade, Iran is losing the equivalent of nearly 1/5 of its monthly government budget every single day. This is not temporary pressure, it is a vicious cycle. Foreign reserves are collapsing, the currency continues to erode, and domestic unrest grows as fuel shortages and unpaid salaries spread. Sanctions had already crippled Tehran's ability to import spare parts and critical components. The blockade has now eliminated its main remaining source of hard currency. The result is a deepening manpower crisis inside the IRGC, maintenance backlogs, reduced training cycles, and declining readiness across naval and missile units. Here's where the situation grows more dangerous. This sustained financial collapse is generating intense political pressure at the highest levels of the regime. Hardline factions within the Revolutionary Guard argue that any further restraint equals surrender and are pushing for direct retaliation. More pragmatic elements warn that escalation would hand Washington the justification for a preemptive campaign capable of destroying Iran's remaining naval and coastal infrastructure. The supreme leadership is caught between a restive population facing increasing hardship and radical commanders who view restraint as ideological betrayal. This scale of daily loss has no precedent in the 4-7-year history of the Islamic Republic. It is politically explosive. The regime's legitimacy depends on projecting strength and defiance, yet the math of survival now forces decisions that undermine both. This is no longer a sustainable strategy. This is calculated self-destruction playing out in slow motion. Tehran is running out of time and acceptable options. While Iran's economic position deteriorates and its internal political fractures deepen, the United States' operational advantage continues to widen with each passing day. Let that sink in for a moment. This advantage has moved beyond simple material superiority. It has become structural and self-reinforcing. The American sensor grid across the strait, combining sonobuoys, towed arrays, dipping sonars, and AI-supported acoustic mapping steadily compresses the safe operating envelope available to Iran's Ghadir submarines. Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines now maintain persistent presence in waters that were once considered a natural sanctuary for the defender. EA-18G Growlers exercise near-total dominance over the electromagnetic spectrum, while layered air defenses and phalanx systems render both swarm boat tactics and kamikaze drone attacks progressively less effective. Every week the blockade remains in place further exposes the limits of Iran's asymmetric arsenal. The United States has already demonstrated it can shut down the majority of Iranian oil exports with minimal escalation and carefully controlled risk. Should Tehran trigger any significant incident, whether through a mine strike, a successful submarine ambush, or a mass drone swarm, Washington is fully positioned to shift rapidly from containment to preemptive degradation. Hundreds of Tomahawk cruise missiles, B-2 Spirit stealth bombers operating from Diego Garcia or the continental United States, and multiple carrier strike packages stand ready. Iran's key naval infrastructure at Bandar Abbas, Karg Island, Qeshm submarine pens, and its network of underground missile facilities developed over decades at enormous cost can now be targeted and severely degraded within a single operational phase. What makes this genuinely different is that every Iranian action now works against its own long-term interests. Each provocation supplies Washington with both the political justification and the operational pretext to escalate on a timeline of America's choosing. By visibly committing its limited and irreplaceable assets so deeply into the strait, Tehran has effectively handed the United States control of both tempo and escalation dominance. This is no longer a sustainable strategy. This is calculated self-destruction. The window for reversible decisions is closing rapidly. Iran's 4-7-year asymmetric strategy has now reached its terminal inflection point. The regime finds itself trapped in a tightening vice, accelerating economic collapse, a critical and growing manpower deficit among its most specialized units, and a military reality that it can no longer shape or control. Every diplomatic gesture issued from Tehran is immediately undermined by the irreversible military commitments already made beneath the waters of the strait. Every additional day of resistance consumes the very resources the Islamic Republic needs for its long-term survival. Here's where the situation becomes truly irreversible. Any meaningful escalation, a successful mine strike, a submarine ambush that causes real damage, or a large-scale drone attack will almost certainly provide Washington with both the justification and the necessary domestic political support for a full-spectrum preemptive campaign. In such a scenario, decades of investment in naval bases, submarine shelters, underground command facilities, and dispersed missile infrastructure could be systematically located and degraded in a matter of days. The math has betrayed Tehran. A doctrine carefully designed over nearly half a century to raise the enemy's costs has instead raised the cost of the Islamic Republic's own continued existence to catastrophic levels. The United States no longer needs to occupy Iranian territory or engage in a prolonged ground war. It only needs to demonstrate, with clinical precision, that sustained defiance carries an irreversible strategic price. This is the grim reality of where this conflict stands. The window for rational reversal has nearly closed. Tehran's remaining choices have narrowed dramatically: strategic humiliation on the one hand, or calculated self-destruction on a regional scale on the other. This is no longer a sustainable strategy. This is the endgame. If you want to track how this endgame unfolds before the mainstream outlets catch up, subscribe to The Rampart. We analyze these inflection points in real time, with no hype, only the merciless math.